Right.
And when it comes to, you mentioned Constantine, so I want to ask you, like what exactly was the Council of Nicaea, and did Constantine have something to do with that? And some of these questions I already know the answer to, or kind of know your response, but I kind of want to form it in a way for people who are first time listeners. I don't want to, I don't want to just like have a conversation that's like up here with with like the history stuff that we're covering. So what exactly was the Council of Nicaea, and was Constantine a part of that, and who is he?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that really, with respect to this question about, again, how did Christianity become seen as a white man's religion? I think we have to be honest about the fact that, number one, no, Christianity is not a white man's religion, and it's not any one man or woman's religion, but it's for all people. But at the same time, we have to tell the truth about the fact that that is how it's seen, and that is the perception of many people. And so I think that with respect to, okay, how did it get seen that way? How is it still seen that way? Then I think that the Council of Nicaea is really one kind of component to a larger paradigm that happens in the early 4th century that, again, has to do with Constantine and his reforms. And not only Constantine, but specifically the way that Christians in the Roman Empire constructed him, because a lot of the ideas we have about Constantine come from Christians writing about him and putting words in his mouth, and not necessarily from the man himself. And so it's really a lot about how Christian, I don't even like to think of it just as the Council of Nicaea or even just Constantine, but it was about the Romanization of Christianity. That in the same way that Christianity, as to use Dr. Ra's wording, if Christianity is being held captive, if it is seen as inseparably linked from whiteness and from European and Western identity, then that goes to the foundation of white Western identity, which is the Roman Empire. I mean, the idea of Europe built itself upon the fallen Roman Empire, and which later would go out and conquer the rest of the world, and create this idea of the West, this unified coalition of various European nations that all were modeling themselves and have a historical link to the Roman Empire. And I mean, even to this day, we still build supreme courthouses and all this kind of buildings. We model it after Greek and Roman architecture. I mean, all the Western world in many ways harkens back to the Greco-Roman world, and that was the point. And the Council of Nicaea was one of the really good ways that you saw that. But basically what happened was that in the 4th century, starting with the conversion of Constantine, that Constantine allegedly converted to Christianity, and then he, and it talks his biography, which was written by a Christian bishop in Rome, which by this Christian bishop named Eusebius was greatly celebrating Constantine, says that he saw the sign of the cross in the sun and was told by God, according to Eusebius, to go out and conquer in the name of the cross. And so this is really the beginning of when you have Christianity being appropriated in the use or in the deployment of a particular nation state or empire, saying that, well, God is on our side and he's given us the ability and the call actually to go out and spread this thing. And so, Constantine began to close down a lot of the pagan temples, and, it's reported that he destroyed them, and he started helping to build churches. And this is when you start to finally have some of the earliest extant still today, like church buildings and basilicas, and even the name basilica, again, or cathedral, all these kind of words that come from Greek and Roman culture and architecture, is when Christianity really started to take on the look and the feel of Rome. Again, just before, it's not a white man's religion. It's not a Roman religion. It makes no sense for people to argue that, Christianity was an invention of Constantine to use as a mechanism of domination. Yes, Constantine did use Christianity as a mechanism of domination, and he told himself that God was on his side. But again, the person right before him, Diocletian, and many other emperors before them were killing Christians. And many of these Christians who they were killing were Africans, were from North Africa, and were from the Middle East. So for people to say it's a white man's religion, it doesn't make any sense, because, again, just a few years before that, it was not cool to be a Christian at all. But people were still dying for the faith. And we have writings from them from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, long before the time of Constantine.
All right. I got a question. I got a question. So, wow, man, you said a lot. I'm trying to pick which one to, trying to pick which one to actually dive in a little bit. So I want to ask you, Yeah, not necessarily to quote a source or anything, but when you say that before Constantine, got the influence that he had, the people who had the power and influence before that were actually persecuting and still killing Christians, and many of them were Africans. Where do we see that in history? Like, how do we how do we know that?
I mean, we know that because the wonderful thing, especially when I look at early African church history, is that not only was Christianity present in Africa in the first, second, and third centuries and going forward, but it was actually the dominant religion at a very early stage. And we see that from textual evidence. Again, I mean, when you look at the vast majority of Coptic literature, if you want, I mean, a lot of people in our community are saying we want to go back to Egyptian religion. We want to be Hoteps and be down with Egyptian religion. Well, actually, Egyptians themselves became Christians at a very early stage. The earliest fragment of the Bible that we have in possession came from Egypt, and that's from like the 2nd century.
P52. You're talking about P52. That's a fragment of John's Gospel that's dated around 125, 130 AD. Yep.
That's right. And then, you got early apologists like Tertullian and martyrs like Perpetual Felicity and Cyprian. And then you got Origen and Clement.
We could go on. Yep.
You got all of these writers that were writing at a time. Regardless of their religious background, any historian that looks at these people do not dispute the fact that these were Christians who lived and wrote their theological literature in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, again, way before Constantine. And so again, I mean, it's and then you got archaeological evidence. You got churches, and you have Christian relics and crosses and liturgical all kind of material evidence that, again, starting in the 2nd century, going up until well after the time of Constantine, you have evidence of Christian churches all over North Africa. And that's just Africa, but I mean all over the world. And so again, this archaeological and literary evidence all point to the fact that Christianity was not only present, but it was actually the dominant religion in all of these places.
Hey, so you said something about, Constantine, like closing down, like pagan temples and stuff like that. I think that part of history is where we get the rumor of, Constantine, he had control and he was killing people to make them become Christians. Can you respond to that objection at all?
I mean, again, there certainly seems to be evidence of that, because even Eusebius himself, who is Constantine's kind of champion, his kind of, biographer who wrote the life of Constantine, does talk about the ways in which Constantine began to persecute pagans, Roman pagans. And we can't shy away from that as Christians, that did happen, that once Christian became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire, it seemed like they was kind of like, we're going to get some get back. And probably the best example of that was, the most famous example, there was a movie about it actually called Agora, was the kind of Greco-Hellenistic philosopher named Hypatia, who lived in Alexandria, who was murdered by Christians. And so under the order of the bishop. And so there was definitely violence perpetrated by Christians. And I think this is unfortunately the natural effect that happens when Christianity becomes militarized and nationalized. And then we've seen this all across Western history. But again, that was not, so I mean, yes, for sure. But I mean, the other thing about it, though, is that we have to acknowledge that happened, but it's also very unclear as to the nature of Constantine's Christianity, because it seems that he was baptized by an Arian bishop. And also even after his alleged conversion, you still find pagan insignia on a lot of his imperial coinage. So it's very questionable as to whether or not how much was Constantine actually himself a committed Christian versus how much did Eusebius really just want him to be and kind of put him up in that light.
Can you tell us for those who may not know, who may be listening, what the significance is of Constantine possibly being baptized by an Arian bishop? Can you tell us why that's important for those who may not know?
Oh yeah, real talk. Yeah, I'm over here church history stuff. But yeah, that's So Arius was a Libyan bishop who argued that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father, that he was a created being. And that was, going back to the other question, actually we didn't get to that, about Council of Nicaea, that was the predominant theological issue on the table in the early 4th century. Basically, it was a question of, is Jesus is he God or is he kind of like God? Is he a lesser God? That was the main question. And Arius had a famous quote that said, there was once when the Son was not. There was a time when the Son did not exist, and then God the Father created him and brought him into existence. And so he was teaching this, and Alexander, who was the bishop of, or the patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt, the Church of Egypt, was arguing. So this was an African debate. This was a North African Libyan arguing against the Egyptian bishop, and it was an internal African debate. There was Africans on both sides of this, but actually the majority of folks would have argued that Jesus was homoousios. He was of the same substance. That was the Greek word that was being used, that at the Council of Nicaea. So the Council of Nicaea is considered the first ecumenical council. Now, again, I find it deeply problematic to call that the first ecumenical council, because again, the church was not only in the Western world, it was not only in the Roman Empire. And so when we only tell, this is why I have an issue with so many church history textbooks, because many of them suffer the same white normativity problem where they tell history only from the perspective of kind of the Western viewpoint. And so the church was growing in the Persian Empire at a rapid pace. And actually the funny thing is that when Christianity was being persecuted in the Roman Empire in the 200s, Christianity was actually much more peaceful in the Persian Empire. So the very part of the world that we call now Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan was actually a much better place to be a Christian 1,800 years ago than it was to be in what we now call Italy or Greece, which I just find ironic. But again, that church over there, they were outside of the Roman Empire, and they had their own ecumenical councils that was very independent than what was going on in the Church of Rome. And again, Constantine did have a very heavy role in Nicaea, in the Council of Nicaea. Eusebius talks about him kind of presiding over it in the style of a bishop, but it wasn't like he was the one making the decisions. And again, it's very, so Constantine was very much involved in it, and he lent a lot of imperial support to the church. And of course, he was siding with the view that was saying, no, Jesus is God. He is not a created being. He is homoousios. He is the same essence, homoousios. He is the same substance as God the Father. But he did not invent that idea. He was not a theologian. And so people like Alexander of Alexandria and Athanasius and a lot of these Nicene church fathers, they were the ones that were making that theological argument. The other thing about that is that, again, like I said, it seems like Constantine may have even towards the end of his life been dabbling in Arian theology. And also Constantine exiled Athanasius, who Athanasius was one of the chief defenders of Nicene Trinitarian theology, that Jesus is the same essence as God. And later on, Athanasius gets sent into exile like 3 times. And and that was by Constantine, the same person. So how do people gonna say that Constantine invented this doctrine of Jesus being God, and then he kicks out Athanasius for arguing that Jesus is God?
Yeah. I was just gonna say, and we don't even know that he, that he even believed it. And in summary, y'all, for those that are listening, the reason. So we heard. We heard, at the end of Dr. Bantu's soliloquy, about some of the things that Constantine did about people who are arguing that Jesus is God. But that's also why it's important, because it's further evidence about him being baptized by an Arian bishop, because an Arian bishop is a person who is of high stature of Arian beliefs, which is that Jesus is a lesser God or not God at all. And that was actually the purpose of the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea is not a group of people who got together one day and it was like, hey, y'all, so let's invent Christianity, or let's create this doctrine that Jesus is God, or let's decide what books are going to be in the Bible and what books are going to be removed. That's not what the Council of Nicaea was. What the Council of Nicaea was 2 sides debating about what the accurate interpretation of scripture actually is as it pertains to Jesus's deity, because Arian was getting really popular in his teaching that Jesus is not God. That makes sense, y'all? Y'all can't talk back, but hopefully it does. Hopefully that does. And also I want to point out, if you guys heard when Dr. Bantu was saying that in the Council of Nicaea, not only is it misrepresented what the Council of Nicaea actually is, but it was actually Africans on that council on both sides, whether you're arguing that Jesus is God or that Jesus isn't. It was people of African descent or associated with Africa who were participating in that. So again, if you're going to argue Christianity, either way, it's true, it's not true, I believe this, I believe that, again, it is a very unlearned thing to say that it's the white man's religion. It's just false, you know.